Chris. Hi, I'm Jim Constantine. This is Chris Cosenza. We're with LRK, so we are the firm that works as the borough planner. And tonight we're here to talk about the future of Cleveland Avenue and also potential recommendations for a redevelopment plan. At the end of that mic, sorry, can you hear me better now? Yes. All right. Yeah, Terry was very excited that we had good miking in the room. Okay. So we set some preliminary goals and objectives at the start of the process. One was to involve the community and the neighborhood in the process of creating a plan that might have better outcomes than existing zoning. Second was to try to identify any existing conditions that could be mitigated or improved. 3, to consider existing buildings, open spaces, and landscape features that could be preserved. Review master plan recommendations regarding zoning and appropriate uses and transitions from non-residential uses to the residential neighborhood. 5, explore ways to optimize positive fiscal impact of non-residential uses, including the proposed private girls' school, which would be a nonprofit use. And then 6, to sort of step back and utilize a smart growth perspective to review any site-specific plans in the broader context. So from that, the existing zoning, and I apologize, Chris, maybe we could just see this. That's as sharp as it gets. So I don't know if you can read the letters here. You can. All right, well, the area in the dashed red at the end of Cleveland is the proposed girls' school site. This light purple color is the existing light industrial zone. This blue strip here is the other side of Cleveland, heading down towards 2nd, that's zoned professional office. And then we have the planned unit residential developments, American Properties and the Pulte closer in that direction. The yellow is the existing RA single-family zoning. A little bit closer detail. So as we zoom in, as I mentioned again, the proposed girls' school site. There also are several isolated lots across the street, 5 of them that they also have under control, which was another reason we recommended taking this examination into potential redevelopment plan process. The LI zone, the PO zone. And we won't talk too much about the uses. I know we did at a neighborhood meeting about what's actually there, because I think we're going to jump towards the master plan next, which identified several issues, and we'll stay very high level. So we'll talk first land use, then economic issues, or what's in the economic plan element, and then go to conservation, open space, recreation plan. So the master plan indicates that a wider range, they use the term widen the range of uses permitted in the LI district. Try to reflect both uses that coexist. Some of the uses that are out there today aren't reflected as permitted in the zoning, and also look to add some other new uses in there. One of the new uses that we did hear about from the neighbors is to possibly consider some amount of small, I'll call it convenience retail, because of the growth of the residential, new residential and emerging residential neighborhood on the south end of Cleveland. Right now, to get a quarter milk, you have to trek, or in some cases drive through blocks and blocks of town. So that was one of the ideas that came out. Second issue in the master plan was rezoning Cleveland from Madison to the end from LI to PO. So that was that narrow strip across from the proposed girls' school. Next is rezoning landlocked parcel along the railroad to LI. I'll show you that in a second. And then identify areas along Cleveland Avenue for redevelopment. That's talked about in the master plan. As well as adopting infill residential design standards if residential is a component of that. So maybe Chris, you could go back for 1 second to the map. Backwards, yeah. So that The area that they talked about rezoning to PO in the master plan is this LI right here, where I indicated I think there's 5 lots that are also under control of the girls' school. The PO zoning exists below Madison, heading towards 2nd on the other side of Cleveland. The area that they talked about trying to rezone LI is this piece of residential that's at the back of the proposed girls' school site in that location. And I guess one of the other issues, that we're aware of is the PO zoning permits single family, but it also permits apartments over office. And so there's sort of a consideration that we heard from neighbors, if the PO zoning were to be applied here, to maybe consider not taking the apartments with it. So it may be a different approach, maybe something we just do with the redevelopment plan. Second set of issues dealt with the economic plan, which was targeting, this was the master plan language, an eclectic mix of uses for Cleveland, for the Cleveland Avenue corridor. So I guess that remains to be determined whether it's eclectic now, what eclectic means. But I think it's a recognition that back in 2003, when this was written, that the area as a solid light industrial district was probably not exactly clear at that time. It's less clear now, and that a lot of the light industrial land has been converted to residential in the lower end of the corridor. And then also evaluate vacant and underutilized areas and consider redevelopment. So that does give us a master plan goal that puts us here tonight to talk about that potential option. Okay? And then lastly, conservation, open space, and recreation plan of the master plan. Talked about designating borough-owned land adjacent to the Mill Brook as passive parkland, and trying to preserve a wooded area along the back of the rail embankment as a wildlife corridor that would connect way into Edison Township. So those things were identified. So those are some overarching master plan issues that could inform what happens here. And should also point out, in addition to what we'll talk about in a little bit about the potential girls' school and the lots across the street, there's also an opportunity here to actually take some of the recommendations for the broader Cleveland Avenue corridor and feed those into the master plan update that the planning board will be undertaking later this year. So we had a community open house, well actually before that, a neighborhood meeting to try to get some real input into the future of the corridor and talk about some of the existing issues, allow you to ask questions and provide feedback. Can I just see by a show of hands who was at any of those meetings? So almost everybody in the room, except for a couple of folks. So we had 2 of those meetings, one with the more immediate neighbors, which included both residential and some of the businesses close to the girls' school site, or the proposed girls' school site. Okay. We gave people some dots and said, where do you live? So the light blue are those locations. The dark blue was supposed to be where you work. I think they ended up landing on people's homes too. The point being, we had a lot of folks come out and participate that live in the Cleveland Avenue corridor, some from further away, but clearly it was we got lots of local stakeholders involved giving us some input. And some of that on places that folks like most in green dots, least in red dots, which included lots of red dots along River Road. Whether some of that was really about traffic and pedestrian hotspots, which are yellow, clearly that was a big issue cited. We got lots and lots of comments from folks. Is that the next? Why don't we skip forward to let you know that we went through, and we'll talk really about a synthesis of it, but we went through every single comment that we got. Lots and lots of them. The biggest topic was really things related to circulation, traffic, parking in the corridor. So as we sort of hone our way in and look at the corridor, but then look specifically at the potential for a girls' school and what recommendations might be provided in a redevelopment plan. And there are no hard recommendations at this point. This is consideration. Tonight's meeting is really to solicit feedback on this to see where the borough goes, so you're helping to inform that process. The first issue that came up, it wasn't the one that was most commented on, but I would definitely say it was a heated issue or a hot issue for lots of folks, was fiscal impact. The fact that the current proposed girls' school site sits in the LI zone. The LI zone is one of the borough's places, similar to the business districts, to try to achieve tax ratables. And we set that goal, which said we want to explore ways to optimize positive fiscal impact of non-residential uses, including the proposed girls' school. We'll then talk about traffic and circulation and then site issues. So let's go forward, Chris. So we heard comments about being concerned that the school might take away a tax ratable property, and just a general concern about tax ratables. And I know that's one of the reasons we set that as a goal. It's a concern that the administration shares as well. Second, but really constituted, I think, more comments, Chris, than any other topic, was traffic and circulation, which doesn't make this anything unique. I say this in every community we've ever worked at anywhere. Traffic and circulation are the most commented upon topics everywhere. They're usually number one. If they're not number one, they're a close number two. So there were issues about some of the intersections on Cleveland that are dangerous. People aren't making full stops. There's sort of a carelessness. And I think that whole nature identified in the master plan of, what is Cleveland? Is it eclectic? I'd say that some of the vacant parcels, some of the transition parcels, it's a little bit of a corridor that's in transition, and there's some places out there that feel a little bit like a no man's land in terms of they clearly aren't a residential neighborhood, but the neighborhood's nearby. There's some emerging residential occurring. Some of the commercial isn't quite clear. There's not a lot of what Jane Jacobs calls eyes on the street at places. And so some of that probably in the physical environment doesn't cause some of the traffic or poor driving behavior, but it doesn't help combat it. It's different than if you're driving down a tight-knit street and it feels like the porches and homes are pulled close. So there were concerns about the increase in traffic. What might that be, given what the current traffic conditions are? We heard some concerns about trying to add sidewalks. If there's going to be a school, there's going to be some of the children walking, the parents as well. So there are currently some sidewalks missing in the area. Same thing you could say about bicycle circulation issues as well, and people identifying a need for more information on circulation, and we're going to talk about that in our recommendations. And then also looking at other impacts related to other schools, and some of that could go to timing of when a potential school would be in operation and impacting the system. So again, in red up here is the proposed girls' site. There are 5 other lots across the street that are also under the same ownership control. And basically in dashed is really the Cleveland Avenue corridor. Again, it's become residential here at Pulte. It will continue with American Properties. It really leaves a smaller area remaining, including in this area here, a few vacant lots. That's why I said it's got this sort of spotty nature to it. It's not consistent and tight. Yes?
Just a quick question. You mentioned that there's some borough-owned land by Millbrook. Could you really point that out on the map? Like right above
Yes.
the proposed school, the borough owns that property?
Yes, there's an intervening strip at the very north of the proposed girls' school that's owned by Amtrak. So there's a little, we'll talk about that,
Okay.
and we have a little zoom in that we'll get to.
Thank you. I appreciate
You're welcome. So continue on traffic and circulation. I said we got the most comments for that. So questions about the bus routes. Who would be bused? Who would walk? Do we need crossing guards? Safety, parents drop off, car access, the bus movements. Lots and lots of issues about that are going to need probably further information. We'll talk about that. And then the parking on the surrounding streets. Will the school make that impossible? And then also some aspects about the school use itself. When there's conferences or other meetings that would draw the parents in. Is there the presence of a party room or rooms that could be leased out for specific functions other than the school itself? So we also had some issues about the site and the zoning. Some of them had to deal with the trees planted on Cleveland and losing trees, and the fact that there's a need to try to figure out how to get some additional trees planted in the corridor. We fully agree with that. And then also about Millbrook itself. It's near the girls' school. There's been some flooding problems there in the past. And how does this development potentially impact or impede the flow of Millbrook? So that gets us back. There's our zoning map. And then moving forward into one last comment. Across from the school, comment from folks, this might have been the neighbors themselves, I think, I'm not sure, that they would like to see single-family homes or townhomes, no high-density housing or business, so they would like to see the parking lot next door be addressed as part of the plan. I think that's the existing parking lot that's there today. Okay. That brings us back into the site. A little bit of a zoom in there. So let me go back for 1 second, Chris, if we could. So we're going to take the site and turn it around this way with Cleveland situated at the bottom. But before we do that, I just wanted to point out on the go back one, across the street, that those lots do back right up to other residential on that side. So this is the proposed concept plan for the girls' school that you saw at the open house. And see that Joseph Stern is here tonight. I guess if we have any questions, could ask him. Basically, Cleveland, Madison, and their proposed movements for buses would be something like this. They would park here, unload. There's some guest parking located near the front of the school, and the teachers would park in the parking lot back here. And then there are 3 lots here and then 2 more down in this portion across the street. They're not contiguous, so I call them sort of isolated. They're really in 3 configurations. So we looked at if the girls' school were to move forward, what some potential recommendations for inclusion or redevelopment plan would be. I should first state that we did step back and think about the light industrial zone. We've been involved with other smaller, close to residential neighborhood industrial zones in some other communities, and it's challenging. The big light industrial development in the region is occurring in places that have great accessibility, and that's why you see that cluster of also greater land areas. So you see that cluster of large distribution facilities, but prior to that there were generations of warehouses, and prior to that there was actual light industrial when we still made things along the turnpike corridor in places like exit 8A. That's shifted down to 8. The center of distribution warehouses for the entire East Coast is, anybody know? Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, right outside of Allentown, Bethlehem. Why? You can get onto Route 81 and shoot up and down the eastern corridor in a parallel to Route 95. So without, zooming out to 30,000 feet and getting too lost, the challenge is trying to find, good fit light industrial uses, particularly when you're up against neighbors. And it's one of the challenges that we see with the existing light industrial zone. However, the fiscal issue that was one of our goals, explore ways to optimize positive fiscal impact of any non-residential use, including the proposed girls' school, was something that the applicant heard, and so there are some thoughts about how to address that, and then we'll go through these other issues one by one. So, fiscal next, Chris. So we're in a if the borough goes into a redevelopment plan process, the borough has greater control over what may happen than if they just rezone. And so one of the things that's been discussed, and I know we definitely had comments from folks in the community, this would not be a pilot under redevelopment, but right now the applicant has offered a voluntary contribution to maintain the borough share of taxes on this property for some period of time, and that's something Borough Council could consider. So that would help address one of the fiscal issues right off the bat. Even though it's a tax-exempt use, there would be some way to maintain coverage of services. So that's an issue that really, I don't want to speak much more about. It's something that really falls to council to consider further, but I think everybody heard you, including the applicant, and so we said it was one of our goals, and we got it in there. That's why we're using the redevelopment process. It gives us more tools. Next. Circulation, public right-of-way issues. So we think there's a need to review the hours of operation in relation to the other schools. Remember that comment we had from members of the public about this. So our understanding right now is that this is proposed as an 8:30 or 8:35 a.m. start. I'll call it sort of a later start, off-peak. Is that adequate? Does it need to be 8:45? That's something that needs to be looked at further, but it's clearly an issue that we're aware of and that the redevelopment plan can provide absolute control over. Next, we need to explore time limits on buses idling to reduce noise and emissions. That was something that folks commented on. Again, within a redevelopment plan, to go back, you wouldn't just be undertaking rezoning, but you're actually able to provide other, really almost, they are contractual requirements by way of a redeveloper's agreement. So the borough would have much greater control, have absolute limits, and their contractual limits, versus under zoning or other regulations. It may say, businesses in the light industrial zone can operate within these hours. Here you can contractually have it to the T. Next is to look at ways to improve the Cleveland Avenue right-of-way. We know there's a need for a turnaround at the end of the street. We think that should be attractive, not just functional. So that also might affect what happens with some of those isolated residential lots across the street as they would be developed. Opportunities for sidewalks and street trees on Cleveland. We think maybe there's some ways that we can push that a little further. Those could be a little extra wide. We'll figure out where trees can go. But the idea would be that we would use the proposed redevelopment of the girls' school to beautify that end of Cleveland as much as possible. And I think you have a beautiful lot there. You need some neighbors, equally so. And then on the Cleveland-Madison intersection, we know that there are some public safety improvements that need to be explored further. I think the neighbors that live there have said that right now it's a bit of a Wild West zone, so that could include flashing stop signs, really bringing the crosswalks out so that it's safe, but somehow creating more friction, slower speed, and enhanced safety. It's important for a school, but it's also important for the couple of neighbors that live there with the conditions tough right now today. Next, Chris. Along the Madison Avenue right-of-way, there are no, in the last 2 blocks, there are no sidewalks and bicycles. It's narrow, it's challenging. I should say there's no sidewalks on one side of the street. So there's a need to look at that corridor further. And I know that the Safe Walking and Cycling Committee of the borough would like to offer some ideas. We don't know exactly what that is, other than there's a concern, and we know that some of the neighbors that live along there also have a concern. We have trees right next to the curb in those 2 blocks, some other things, so maybe it's narrowing the street as part of a way of making it slower moving and less hospitable to the fast movements that are occurring. Looking at the Millbrook area, we talked about this, as master plan identifies it as a borough passive parkland. And we've had some conversations with the proposed girls' school about contributing to some sort of a pathway that would extend to the Millbrook and then over into Edison. There is an intervening piece of land owned by Amtrak, and on the other side in Edison, there are other property owners in Edison. So there's coordination that would need to occur. However, if it's in a redevelopment plan, it gives much greater standing to go to Amtrak or to seek some assistance from higher levels of government to try to allow that to become as connected as possible. And then what we're recommending relating to all of these circulation issues, but particularly one that I think came out, which is really understanding what's proposed with potential busing and parent drop-off. Where are they coming from? What does all that mean? The proposed girls' school has had their traffic engineer prepare a report. We believe it's time for the borough to have its engineer review that and basically provide sort of a independent assessment on behalf of the borough, because it's the borough's representative. So that's the mechanism that we're suggesting occur relative to all these circulation improvements. Okay, Chris? So there's a couple of other issues that we need more information on with the site related to easements on the property itself and the Amtrak property next door. Those would be explored and placed in to the redevelopment plan. So some of that affects some of the property on this side, and this is that intervening Amtrak piece right here.
Like a triangle shape?
Yes. Correct? Yes. So can't somehow get that pathway through there to get down and over to here. But yes.
What is the right of that Amtrak piece of property? What's that?
That's the borough. No.
And then Amtrak has that slice.
Correct.
And then what's in the triangle right here? It's just, it's very jagged. I'm just trying to understand. Yes.
This piece here.
Yeah.
Borough.
And
Yeah.
then also at the top, is that Amtrak up there as well? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, okay. And this is the area that the master plan talks about trying to retain as wooded, as a wildlife corridor through there. It's in the master plan, so.
Actually, can you go back one more second?
Sure.
That piece of sort of pie that from Cleveland Avenue that juts up next to, that, down, yes, right in there. Where is the Millbrook? Is it right over there? Is that what's happening?
I think it's right about here.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Sure, sure.
If you don't mind, thank you. I didn't know if it's my eyesight or.
First of all, Millbrook is right through this triangle.
Oh, it's in the tree.
Mr. Stern, can you just,
Turn the other way.
Microphone? Diane wants to see as well, thank you.
And the microphone, please.
Millbrook is running under the tracks right over here, right through here, and then I think it veers into someplace in this area. Amtrak's piece of property is this triangle, and it continues. They reserve 63 feet from their track to this tower property line. And that piece continues down all the way down to Cleveland, all the way down to River Road.
That's their
One,
maintenance, yeah.
it's one, I think it's one left. It's one, whatever, it's one continuous.
Continuous.
Yeah.
I believe that this is Edison, New Jersey.
That's the
I
Edison line
believe
there?
that this is Edison, New Jersey.
The Edison
And-
is further.
Yeah.
it's- That lot is owned by the other school in Edison.
That's Edison.
It's
Or
owned by
school
Alpha
in
Line as
Edison.
well.
But the parcel itself is in Highland Park.
Oh, it's in Highland
Go
Park,
back
but it's
one.
Edison owned.
Go back one, Chris, to the
Right, so that was-
turn view.
I don't really, I think it's the
Or two.
borough.
Right, right, the parking lot is functioning,
Yeah.
I could probably zoom out.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And just that little triangle, go back to this triangle right over here is borough owned. The pump station is right over here, and this is where the ravine gets all the way down.
So it's service, we own it for service reasons, right?
This is the end of the road, the end of Highland, and from this point on, you basically go down the road.
Perfect. It's just odd because it's so jagged, I couldn't understand. Thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah. So that's what, go back to the other one, Chris, did we have, was that the biggest blow up we had of that?
That was. I could zoom out with my tool.
Okay. No, that's okay. So, I mean, you can see here the boundary following the dashed yellow at the top, municipal boundary.
It's further.
It's further north, excuse me. Okay, further north. So you can't see far enough. You'll hit the parking lot of the synagogue and the school on the other side of the boundary. Okay, so let's go forward. So there's a whole bunch of that in the redevelopment plan, the mapping, all these questions we're asking because there is basically not a good existing base map at this point that we'd want to include. We'd also want to include the isolated lots across from the school site on Cleveland. So the thought there is to, and there were a couple of different ideas that were kicked around during this process. Some were, do we try to use those for light industrial? Well, they're small, they're isolated, they touch residential on the sides and on the rear. If you just zoned it PO, you would allow for single-family homes, but that also brings apartments over office. So our thought at this moment is that it might be better to look at a limited residential zoning of those properties for single-family, two families, possibly on the largest property where there's 3 lots together, some townhomes. I think we want to make sure, though, that the design standards for that infill housing actually is a chance for the borough to address one of its master plan goals and try to have it really exhibit a little better character, you know, house front, narrow driveway. If there's townhouses or two-family, maybe it's actually a little service lane from behind so that it looks very attractive. I mean, it's an opportunity if you're going in this direction to change the character. I also think it would be highly likely that folks that perhaps are sending their children to the school would be interested in those homes, and we'd sort of complete the neighborhood fabric. So on that last block of Cleveland, there would be the medical practice with its parking lot, but that everything else from Mary's house all the way down would be residential on that side of the street. So at this point, we'll take comments, feedback, input. Yes, sir. We may need to pass the microphone around, yeah, okay, for him to pick you up on television.
Thank you. I'm Lou Garlai, adjacent property owner. I just had a question about this. Is that a sewage pumping station? I know there is a facility at the end of Cleveland. It's shown in that notch in the photo, the aerial from prior. And there's that little notch up at the end of Cleveland, and there's a pumping station that Mr. Stern referenced. And I was just curious, that's a sewage pumping station, I believe, and so that facility would need to be maintained and stay in that position, in that location? That's the Middlesex County Improvement Authority facility? Do you know? I'm just curious as to what exists there, and I don't know the impact it's going to have on this development, because I know at the end of Cleveland, right adjacent to Mr. Stern's property, there's a pumping station. You just made reference to it, but I wasn't clear exactly what it is.
Yeah, the borough engineer hasn't looked closely at that, but that's my understanding. Alan, do you know anything more about it?
No, but to answer your question, would have to be maintained, etc. Whenever a development plan is put in place, the engineers do review it to ensure that there is proper sewage and water and all of that. So if in fact that facility is a sewage pumping station, I'm not 100% sure it is. If it's going to be large enough to assume the needs of that school or not, that would be addressed by the engineer in the process.
And that goes through the Middlesex County utilities.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I was more curious about access too, that they would need to access it 24/7 and 365, obviously, sewer, sewer operated, right?
That is a sewage pumping station. Middlesex County is down there every day doing some kind of maintenance to it, and that's why they always plow the snow on that street. It's not just for us. And sometimes you can smell that it is a sewage.
One other little piece of history, it's interesting. So we talked about the Amtrak easement and access. So this is the major commuter Northeast Corridor, right? Busiest rail line in North America. However, at one point, there was, when this was zoned light industrial, there were probably rail sidings here. I suspect there were in Edison, there were further up the road in Metuchen, over the river in New Brunswick, and into North Brunswick, the oldest sections down the Livingston Avenue. You access light industrial lands along there. So, but the corridor, the rail corridor, the whole nature of transportation, we're about 5 generations beyond that. But that, in fact, in part, was probably why this was originally zoned here. And there's nobody using those rail sidings for freight.
Light rail.
For freight anymore, yeah, light rail. So other questions? Yes, Alan.
Could you outline the process? You have the redevelopment process that goes to the planning board. Is that correct?
Well, what would happen, we're not in a formal redevelopment plan yet. We haven't been authorized to do that. So tonight is really to see whether this has the makings of a concept or a strategy that should be looked at moving forward into a redevelopment plan, in which case council would authorize that and planning board would have a chance to review. But it would basically be the details on what I explained at a very high level this evening. Well, so we asked that the borough engineer, CME Associates, that their transportation group within their firm review what's been put together. But Mr. Stern, would you maybe just walk through the plan and just what you're proposing and parking you on? Okay. So Chris,
I just
Chris,
want
if
to
we
address,
could go back to
in the modern age of technology, you can create presentations that look like they're expensive and, as she said, a fait accompli, but nothing, that's technology.
Yeah, but also.
But I just want to make it clear.
But the presentation doesn't have any other alternatives. And I'm just making a comment that I think is going to be a massive parking problem.
Yeah, we were charged to look at the Cleveland Avenue corridor overall and the potential for the girls' school. That was our charge, not to come up with other. So certainly one option the borough has is to leave the zoning light industrial. So again, what we understand about this is that the teacher parking is located in this parking lot here at the end of the building, and what's been represented to us that we want to have our borough engineer review is that that's adequate for the teachers that are necessary and the staff for the school. In addition, there's also some angled spacing in front. So I think there's a question of whether some of that is also for teachers or guests, and that the buses would pull in, and that there are, I think, 4 or 5 that can stack up in that direction. So we wanted to have the borough's expert on that, the transportation group at CME, the borough's engineer, review this.
Your point, we have run into some major traffic issues at the schools now that are a good indication of what could happen elsewhere.
And so that would be something the engineer would look at. Yes?
Is the green part behind the building?
This would be play yard and open space behind there. And then you can see the outlines of the edges of the wooded corridor.
And then part that's between American Homes and the proposed school, the medical building, is that supposed to be part of the redevelopment, or is would that be part of a broader redevelopment area, or would that be?
No, the proposed redevelopment area would just affect the properties that are under control of the school. The medical building, the one on this side of the street, is located right here. Is that a radiology practice? Physical therapy, excuse me. Physical therapy with its parking lot is right here. And then they have lots here,
The place where Dr. Schick is, that's
here, and there's...
That's across the street.
right. That's not going to.
That's an office, we think of it as an office building.
Right, but that's
Right.
not going to be part of the redevelopment.
No,
It's not gonna be-
no. The intent would be to leave that, and then the other, sort of the commercial line is here, and there's nothing proposed affecting that.
When I was at the meeting on January 31st, and I spoke to 3 people representing the school, Mr. Stern and 2 others, and I got what I understood to be 3 very different answers about traffic going to the school in terms of buses, cars, bicycles, and students walking. And when you say that the borough engineer is going to start with the traffic plan that they had already completed, given what I heard from some of the other representatives, are all the views going to be presented? They had an excellent map about where current families live. And for those people living on the north side, I thought that was very illustrative of where people were coming from. But the traffic's not just going to be on Cleveland Avenue. I think that there's going to be a larger impact. And I just want to make sure that all of this is being addressed, and the multiple views that I heard from multiple representatives are being factored in.
Yes, and I think that is why we want to have a very good examination of what they've prepared, but we want to have the borough's expert working for the borough verify that it, and basically provide a check on that, on what they're proposing and what they're representing. Yes?
Question maybe more for the town than for you, to be honest. But I live on Harrison Avenue. My bedroom faces the construction site. So I'm understanding there are limitations on when the construction takes place, or what hours that would be, like trucks coming in or noise, if the way construction does commence, or.
Well, since I've been mayor, and there've been a couple of construction projects that have begun. We've been able to negotiate with the builders. So for instance, there was a limit on Jewish holidays, for instance. There was no construction going on. And then there were traffic issues that we were able to designate specific routes for trucks. So that's all something that we can talk to the developer
It's not all about me, but if you want to shift work and see,
Sure.
things always an issue, so.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Great, thanks.
We'll make sure that we address that.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
I'm concerned about emergency evacuation. If you're going to be having 400 plus children plus teachers, and it's a narrow road, I understand the turnaround, but if you had to get that many people out in a short amount of time, have there been viability, or will there be viability studies on having that done safely and effectively?
Fire trucks.
We'll make a note of that. I mean, the streets are where they are. We haven't had a public fire department and emergency services review. So we'll add that into that analysis that we're calling for. So we're in framing this evening. There's the thing that, again, it sits in borough control all through the redevelopment process, is that even deciding to go into a redevelopment plan isn't sanctioning the use, it isn't approving the use, it's just allowing the borough to use greater tools to examine it. Normally these things wouldn't get examined until after an application is filed. And again, the control that you have is that we haven't zoned it yet. We're just saying these are things that could be addressed in a redevelopment plan where you have greater tools. Zoning. Let us flip it back to the zoning map. So as I mentioned earlier, the master plan is going to be updated by the planning board this year.
When does that start?
Actually, background studies have started already. So they're compiling updated
It has to be done
demographics,
by 2020.
mapping. Has to be done this year.
So that we will be, yes, they'll be open, charrettes and all that stuff.
Right. So as I mentioned before, we went through all the issues. There are some, when we have reviewed the light industrial zoning, seen the recommendation of the master plan, it's clear, I don't think it's had a refocused lens on it in decades. So this is a chance to do that, not in the redevelopment plan related to the school, but as part of the master plan update for the planning board. However, this has already gotten us started to think about that. For instance, in the commercial zones in town up on Woodbridge Avenue, and they may exist as well on Upper Raritan, not downtown, you can have laboratories, but you can't have laboratories here. So that's like one of the uses. One of the recommendations that came from neighbors was to allow, because of all the residential here, and really because these neighborhoods are quite far from the avenue, is to possibly look at whether or not there could be some small, I'll call it, I'm going to use the term convenience retail. You're not going to get a high trip generating 7-Eleven or something like that over here. There's not the pass-through traffic to warrant it, but there might be something that's smaller scale. I'll call it a classic neighborhood convenience store, corner store. Somebody may or may not be interested, but that was a recommendation. So there's a whole series of those uses to look at relative to the light industrial zone, and there's probably uses currently called for in the zoning that we don't have and don't stand likelihood for. So there's general updating, and that would occur within the master plan later this year. Start. The brown is the plan unit residential development 2, so that's the American Properties parcel.
Is that more townhouse?
Yes, more residential. Right. And again, one of the other things that's in the current master plan is to carry the PO zoning down here. However, our initial sense is, in just looking at this, is that the PO zone permits single-family homes, which is compatible, but also apartments above commercial And that may not be something that you really want to have here against all these single-family homes and next to others.
Zone has some empty lots in it.
It does, I
It's all
mentioned that,
residential, right?
I mentioned that before, yeah, there's some isolated,
Yeah.
no, there,
In both parts though.
yeah, their zone professional office,
But it's empty. I
but
mean,
they're
it's
empty,
down.
they're empty,
But they're owned by individuals.
yeah. So again, I think for from the planning board standpoint, later this year in the master plan is to maybe go ask some questions and try to focus, what can we do? This came up what can we do to get those missing teeth filled in?
Yeah.
And filled in properly? Yes?
I want to comment about the traffic and the parking situation. So what you're showing us does not look unlike, the areas around Bartle and Irving. And I can only anticipate that a school would actually be better for pedestrian safety because we have kids in the schools and we know that is very well controlled. There is timing, there is the stop sign, there is a crossing guard. I can only imagine that we would need that here, and so the issue that we have with the stop sign at Madison and Cleveland is probably the worst it could be now, rather than having the school there. So I just want to point out that I think this can only help. When you have a school and you know that there's a school there, you're going to be extra vigilant. At drop-off and pickup, you're going to have a crossing guard, you're going to have your blinking stop sign or whatever we put in place, and so I just want to point that out.
So you raised some really good points, and that is also part of what we have to discuss with the developer of the school, because you want to ensure that the school's providing the safety that the children will need for the crossing.
I do have to say though, I think we're at an advantage here to design the building at this stage, whereas with Irving and Bartle, which were literally built 100 years ago when we didn't have anywhere near this kind of traffic, and the traffic was spilling out onto Route 27, parked cars.
And nobody drove their kids to school.
And nobody drove. Right.
So, Alan, I had a question for you, sitting on the Environmental Commission. So, the master plan talks about this, what's labeled QP, the quasi-public Millbrook property that connects up to the Edison boundary, which is the dashed line at the top. If we end up with a trail through there, are there other benefits that you see from an environmental perspective?
It would, among other things, you could give the deer another path to go on. And the deer are coming off the north side also. It'd be beneficial.
Are the herds coming all the way down to the river and then making their way back, or?
They're everywhere.
So we actually, just a side note, we actually are under the advice of the Fish and Wildlife part of the DEP. We're actually having a drone follow at a peak time to indicate to us the paths of the deer throughout town. That's a first step.
To come to my
It comes in all our yards.
And they steal birdseed.
They steal birdseed. I saw a cardinal for the first time this year today. It's a good sign.
I saw two cardinals. But do note that there is interest in trying to make this pedestrian connection in that direction there.
I wouldn't be in favor of pedestrians, certainly not vehicle access. My gosh, it's busy enough. So, right. Right. Well, they can build a bridge, but the point is, again, that wouldn't help for, maybe to walk people out, but it wouldn't help in an emergency circumstance for access. You really need 2 points or 3 points for any business, any development needs that kind of access. To pigeonhole a school in a dead end doesn't make sense.
So the corollary to that one is that the existing zoning allows things that are potentially high truck generative uses, warehousing, and so you would replace, I'll call it, several school bus trips with potentially dozens of truck trips with the same sort of constraint and the same sort of impacts on those of you that live in the neighborhoods through here. So that's one of the trade-offs. That's one of the sobering realities of the LI district. Is it the best location? I will tell you that Chris and I have lots of experience dealing with that type of zoned use, and wherever it's near residences, you have conflict, and there's a lot of virtue for having it near big exits on big highways, where you sort of expect it, you can more easily manage it, and it can be what it wants to be. The truck drivers come in, they're usually not from your local community. They have less disregard. I know there's traffic problems in every community, and many times it's your neighbors that are the worst, sometimes some of the worst violators, but the trucks can be even worse. So we believe it's something like this at the end of the street.
So it would be a single lane.
Single lane turnaround so that the vehicles perhaps going in here may use it, and then the return, but we think it's something like that. And whatever happens with the properties that they control on the other side, that's where I was saying we need some of those residential design standards, because you can't have the turnaround with driveways to townhomes. You need to tuck that in behind, frame it nice, and we want Cleveland Avenue to not feel like it got shoddily finished on one side of the street with all the effort for the school. So the idea is to, try to make it as nice as possible and a place that everybody's proud of in the borough if the borough decides to move forward.
My primary concern is safety. We just went to a town, Seattle, and within the town there was a synagogue and a school, not a dead end, but it was a double road. And the turnaround that they had was huge. So they did have a lot of parking, but they had enough space so that if there would be need for any emergency vehicles, they could easily get down, but it was a wider street. It was double width, it wasn't a single street like that.
Who owns the property that costs way more than where you think?
Where my finger was, it's owned by Mr. Stern and the girls' school. So, and again, that's why we recommended looking at this in the redevelopment process, so that those properties could be looked at simultaneous with the school. Well, what we were charged with was if the borough decides to move forward with a redevelopment plan for the school, how can that create the best possible result?
And that's just for this portion of Cleveland, not the rest of Cleveland.
Yeah, we're not.
That's a whole
The rest of
subdivision.
Cleveland, we did talk about trying to update the zoning in the master plan process this year. Clearly identified there are problems with the existing zoning.
Office buildings to bring in, this is Cleveland Avenue. This is not, today, offices are going onto main roads, into towns, into areas, right adjacent to turnpikes, right adjacent to access to traffic, to main roads. This is not conducive for a developer to build a piece of property and put up a 50 or 100,000 square foot building and have him sit empty with it the rest of his life. That's not the game plan.
But there is a difference under the redevelopment plan. There can be an obligation that you have to proceed in a timely manner. So if you're trying to take vacant, fallow, unproductive land and somehow make the community better, the redevelopment plan actually, through that plan, does have specific deadlines and timelines that have to be abided by.
You can explain a little bit the difference between if it goes into a redevelopment plan, what are some of the things that the borough has that it doesn't if it goes into if it's not part of the redevelopment plan?
Sure. So through this process, we've identified some improvements to Cleveland Avenue, turnaround, streetscape improvements, the intersection of Madison, something that really deals with the safety there, potential pedestrian bicycle improvements in that direction. We can require all of those things in a redevelopment plan. Under zoning, you can ask for them. You have to have a rational nexus, which is this use causing the issue that you need to resolve that for? In a redevelopment plan, you can just make it an improvement that's required. You don't have to go through the rational nexus. In the end, under normal zoning, there may be a small contribution towards some of those improvements that you can only require. The other thing is there's the ability to have a redeveloper's agreement. So under normal zoning, this light industrial piece could be developed, it could remain vacant, it could be sold to any other party who could come in and do something that's permitted under the existing zoning, and the borough has no say. You basically have to just receive it. In terms of traffic improvements, it is assumed, there's a basic premise under that the existing zoning, that the borough, by zoning it that way, has basically assumed that the traffic generation from any use that's permitted under the zoning is already permitted. So you actually can't turn anything down. So let's just say for a second you got something that had dozens and dozens of truck trips, loading days out, and everybody looked and said, okay, now I've seen my worst case scenario. Now the nightmares come. It's permitted under the zoning. You can't say no. You cannot turn it down on the basis of traffic, because you've already effectively baked that into the current permissions. The redevelopment zone, we can have our borough engineer review this. If there's things we need to adjust in terms of the time, the operation, start time with the school, looking at all these things, we can get into it at a much higher grain, and we can do it ahead of adopting a redevelopment plan. Those could be provisions in the plan, and then you also have contractual agreements. So, for instance, if we went into a redevelopment plan, then the borough can designate a conditional redeveloper. It's Mr. Stern. The property can't be sold to another entity to build anything that's permitted under the redevelopment plan. This is a contractual obligation, and there can be an agreement when the construction will start, when we'll finish, open. I think that's a desire that they have anyway. So there's a whole series of greater controls that you have available. Sure, you're welcome.
Ownership of land, et cetera, but I just do want to point out that you did buy industrial land. It's zoned like industrial. He wants to change that. So it's a little bit different than the way he presented it. That being said, I have a comment. That building that's shown, is this the scale, I assume, this rendering?
It's an aerial photograph.
It is, right? Okay.
Yes.
So that white square is 120 feet back to the left.
That's
that
you.
Building is the self-storage facility is 120 feet by 120 feet. It's 14,400 square feet. So that's 3 buses. The front wall of that building is the equivalent of 3 40-foot buses. So I'm imposing that white block on that driveway in front of the school. I don't see 5 or 7 buses in that zone. I see 3 maybe in that parking lot. If you're following my aerial perception, right? How many of those buildings are going to fit in that parking lot? 1.5 maybe. So that building represents 3 buses, the front wall of that building. So I have an issue with the traffic flow as it's being presented. I don't think it's going to work. I'm sorry?
I thought earlier you said you put 3 to 4 buses.
3 to 4 buses, right? But 200 kids with, there's 40 kids in a bus, that's 5 buses, and that's at 200 kids. I understand there's 220 and a goal of 400, so that's 10 buses. Or 20 half buses, right? So I mean,
So that's why we want to have the borough's traffic expert review.
And the turnaround at the end is going to be problematic with the sewage pumping station. I don't see how you turn a 40-foot bus around a little circular turnaround.
Well, I believe the buses would come in here and go there. They don't have to come to the end.
Fire trucks can get around the back of the building also.
Well, they're going to have to satisfy the fire department.
My first thought is the buses should be unloading in the back. There should be a driveway that goes all around, so they would come in, go around the back, and come out the other side.
All I can identify on the plan is it says bus drop-off zone, and so what I understand is they intend to have the buses pull over and drop off kids directly, crossing no driveway. You want the buses to basically have the unloading on the school side, right? So similar to what I described here, so that you're coming out the right side of the bus where they have their door, not crossing anything for a safe route. So it would probably mean you'd have to have a driveway down here. So the two challenges with that from a safety standpoint are, one, any buses that are turning here would be forced to slow down and make a very quick left.
Not to go in that way, to come out that way.
But if you're trying to run them around the back side and drop them off, you'd have to unload on the safe side of the bus to the school, and then that places a driveway very close to Mr. Garlotti's driveway, which is the second. So I think there could be some safety issues with buses turning, immediately stopping, blocking that driveway, having to turn there, and then you're very close to the corner with those conflicts versus the ability to sort of slow down and then wind a slow turn in at that point.
I think also the point of tonight is to hear and collect everybody's comments, not to do the plan for this. So if anybody has any additional comments, Chris has been very actively taking notes. And so the next time we all talk, I'm sure we'll have the results of this conversation looked at in a more cogent fashion. And we'll be able to talk about, drop-offs and where and turnarounds and all of that. So I want to wrap it up.
I also just want to comment, in general, we are very fortunate to have a developer here who is a homeowner in town, who cares a lot about this town and wants what's best for that town, which is not true of many of our developers. So I hope that we can work with him in a productive way. And any improvements that are done as part of the redevelopment process, they aren't just going to benefit the school, they're going to benefit the town. So if they change Madison Avenue, my kid's pediatrician is right there. If we change something about pedestrian access, that helps my kids get to school safely in Edison. So I'd like the town not to sort of have the attitude, how much can we get out of this, but to help, because there are a lot of positive things that come out of this that would help me a lot in my family, even though our kids don't go to this school.
All right, so if there are no other comments, I want to thank you all for coming out and for your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.